Okay, so here's my second example of how to properly debug a program. In this example, I'm not exactly going to be going by my written method for how to debug. I'm just going to do it how I would actually do it. And you'll notice that I take the same steps, kind of, and I look for the same things. Sometimes I'll skip a few steps, but in general, it's a similar sort of process. And this is a program that I wrote for manipulating image metadata. I'll explain what that is in a second. But basically, I'm not going to go through the entire program and explain to you how it works, but I'll just show you how I would go about debugging it, because this is more about learning the process rather than actually learning how the code that I wrote works. And what I did is I wrote this a couple weeks ago. I messed it up last week. I added a bunch of errors in addition to the ones that probably already were there. And so I'm looking at this with a fresh mind, and I don't even remember all the things that are messed up here. So we're really going to have to go in and debug this. Let's get started. So first I'm going to go to my desktop so I can actually run this program. That's where I have it saved. And then I believe it's called metadata.py. So what this program is supposed to do is, here's the usage information. You're supposed to be able to, through the command line, type in metadata.py, give it an input file or directory, an optional output directory, and then a mode. And then based on the mode you give it, it will take the input file or all of the files in the directory that you specify. It'll apply these changes to it, and it'll output an identical file in the output directory, but with the metadata manipulated. And picture metadata, by the way, is every image has information associated with that image that is stored within the image itself. And you can view it in Windows. Here's a picture of a puppy I found. You can view it in Windows if you go to Properties, Details, and here's all the image metadata. So you'll notice this. The person who created this image was some random dude, and the date it was taken was that date, April 27th. So we're going to be trying to forge that, manipulate it, and put it in this output directory here. So let's get started with our debugging. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to test some inputs that the user might enter and see what happens with the program and if it does what I want it to do. So let's start by testing the usage information screen. So if the user enters the -h flag here, what it should do is it should print the usage information. So I'm going to test that. And yes, it does indeed print the usage information. However, there's a bit of a problem here. It says -h is not a directory. I don't want it to say that. I want it to say something like, here's the usage information. So also, in case you didn't notice, I am a fan of sassy error messages. But let's go back here. The relevant portions of code for this are, well, this is what it's actually printing out here. So it's getting all the way down here eventually, and it's ending execution over here. However, I want it to end execution over here. I want it to print out this. You'll notice that I check if the input is equal to -h. In Python, you can compare strings using 2 equals, by the way. You'd actually compare the addresses using is. That's a very Python specific thing. But we're actually going in. What I want to do is to go in here and print, okay, fine, you ignorant bastard, here's how to use this program. But it's not doing that. So the significant variables here, in this case, are input. That's our only variable that's affecting the flow of the program. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to print out the value of input right here. And I'm going to see what it is and whether or not it's equal to the -h that I want it to be equal to. I'm also going to exit here so that the program doesn't continue executing. It just stops there after printing out the input so I can see what the input is. So right there, I can see that although I wanted the input in this case to be -h, it was actually the path of the file that I'm currently executing. So clearly this variable input does not look the way I want it to look. So I'm going to use backtracking and go back and figure out where I last modified input. And you'll notice that I last modified it right here. I set it equal to sys.argv0. And the reason I know that is because here's an if-else. If it actually executed the code in the if portion, then it would have printed this out. Of course, this was not printed out to the screen, so it must have done what's in the else. And I'll notice that input was set here to sys.argv0. So what I want sys.argv0 to be is the -h, so that input is -h here. But apparently, it's actually the path of the file we're currently executing. And I can check that if I'm not entirely sure that this statement works correctly. I can check that by just printing out the value of sys.argv0. And you'll notice, yes, indeed, the value of sys.argv0 is a path to the current file. It is not -h, and we want it to be -h. So at this point, you may have to look into the documentation for sys.argv, but I know that the way sys.argv works is that the 0th index will give you a path to the current file that is being executed, and then starting at 1 is where you have your first argument that's passed in via the command line. So the way I would fix this in that case is I would change this to a 1. And the reason somebody could have made an error like this, I did it on purpose for the sake of showing this, but the reason somebody could have made an error like this is because they might think that the arguments are 0 indexed, like in some other programming languages, but in Python they're actually starting at index 1 because 0 gives you the path of the file. I think it works a similar way in C actually. But we can always check this. Let's actually, here we're already printing out input, so I don't need to put another print statement. Let's just see what input is here. Yeah, so now it's -h, and that's what we want it to be. So now our program should correctly print out the usage information the way we want it to. Oh, and right off the bat, I know I made that mistake here, so I probably made it somewhere else. And so I'm going to go ahead and fix it just by adding 1 to the index, like I did here. Every other time I use sys.argv. I think that's, yeah, those are the only times that I actually call sys.argv. So now let's keep going. And yes, we have the correct usage information, including our message that's telling us that they're printing out the usage information. Perfect. So we know that that works.